All right, well, good afternoon and welcome. This is Michael Constantinidis with the ECS section at the State Office of NRCS Pacific Islands area. And the topic of our talk today is going to be species selection for mixed agroforests. And this presentation is actually fairly similar to last week's theme when we were talking about species selection for habitat restoration with myself and Jennifer Higashino. And what we want to do today is provide some basic background for creating a planting list and a review of some of your important planning considerations, going through some examples in the presentation, and then also using the veg spec to come up with a list and a quick demonstration of the implementation requirement template for a mixed agroforest. Before I dive into the specific topic, I want to go over a publication that I contributed to that was put out by Craig Elovich and some other folks. And this is an important document, I think. It kind of represents something akin to Cliff's Notes for agroforestry. And it was designed with NRCS technical assistance and programs in mind. And so it's really an interesting document, and I think Craig did a really great job. He did the heavy lifting on this one, and I just provided some input. But what he has in there, on the right you'll see 10 small thumbnails, and what those are 10 agroforestry systems that he framed up. And so what the publication does is it goes through each one of those, and it provides a name and description of the system, the economic and ecosystem benefits that system provides, some basic specs and considerations. You'll also see a sketch and an image of examples of that system. Finally, there will also be some species examples that are good species for such systems. And then last, you'll see a list of typical NRCS practices. So that's, for some reason, the link isn't showing here, and that got corrupted. I think it's on a website called agroforest.info, but it's also on our PIA forestry webpage. There's a link to it there. So a couple of different ways to get at it. I encourage you to take a look.
Can we send it out after this training, the link to everybody?
Yeah, I'll try and make sure it's fixed on the presentation. That will be in our library when that goes up.
Great.
So what is agroforestry? Just a really quick review. We're talking about trees plus another component, either crops and or animals. And as with all of our systems, we're addressing resource concerns, some of the typical ones shown there. But what the forest component of agroforests also tend to include are other components of interest to our cooperators, timber and both timber and non-timber forest products such as fruits, nuts, spices, fodder, maybe medicines, and other types of non-timber products. So we already address some of these things in our current planning and our specs. We have our mixed agroforest tech note. We're working on windbreaks and silvopastures, which oftentimes include trees that produce non-timber forest products. But today we're going to focus mostly on that mixed agroforest. Before, again, I dive right into that particular system, I just thought this is an interesting summary that you might want to take a look at. The colors each represent a typical or broad agroforest category. And why I wanted to show you this is it illustrates how different agroforestry systems interact with our NRCS conservation practice standards, which are in the left column. And what you'll see is at the beginning, all our systems tend to rely on the same two practices, some type of way of preparing the site. And then what you have in the middle is for each of the different agroforestry systems, you kind of have a different planting practice. But really, we're just talking about planting trees and shrubs in different configurations. So all those are our specific standards that address each agroforestry system. And then at the end, they kind of all unify again, where your supporting practices tend to include things like conservation cover, mulching, maybe fence, and other things like that, maybe a wildlife management practice. So as I mentioned, we're going to focus mostly on mixed agroforest today, and I would ask you guys, what do you see here? And does anybody want to share their thoughts on what they're seeing? Okay, well, I think for somebody who's really familiar with plants, they would recognize various species and what they might be representing in terms of a planting list in an ecosystem. But for the untrained eye, this probably looks a bit like just forest or jungle. But what this really is a very highly managed agroforestry system that's providing ecosystem services, but a lot of other things that are important to the cooperator. So what's in a name? Really, this mixed agroforest has a lot of synonyms or equivalent names that you'll see in the literature. Our Conservation Practice Standard 379 is called multi-story cropping. In the Grower's Guide document that I showed a little earlier, there are 3 systems that are akin to this: forest farming, multi-story agroforestry, and home garden agroforestry. These are all really parallel concepts, if not completely overlapping in some instances. So when you get into talking to a cooperator about possibly installing that kind of a system, you'll want to ask, as we mentioned last week, what's driving the conversation, or consider what's driving the conversation as well. So yes, we're addressing our resource concerns and problems. We're certainly incorporating the cooperator's objectives, and there may be a particular plant or mixture of plants that cooperator is interested in. What's an important part of the conversation you'll want to have with the cooperator is that we're saying that these are forests first, and agroforests that may provide secondary benefits second, that they're very complex, very diverse, and the sketch from Grower's Guide is shown there on the bottom right to give you an idea of the spatial diversity and complexity in both a side view and an aerial view of that ecosystem. So I think that's just a really good sketch. Then you'll want to think about a little bit, where are you starting from? And one of the keys for deciding which of our 2 planting practices is most likely going to be the one you'll use is what's going to be on the ground in terms of vegetation after your site has been prepared for planting. And if you have existing beneficial vegetation that you're keeping on the site and you're going to enhance it, you're pretty much usually talking about using Conservation Practice Standard 379 or multi-story cropping, because what we're going to be doing is you have at least 1 canopy layer in the existing system, and we're going to be adding at least 1 new one. And that comes with some, you want to keep in mind programs there, because, for example, in the picture on this slide, you'll see a coffee plantation, and it has acacia koa trees scattered throughout the plantation, and they're providing some diffuse shade, which is good for coffee. If you don't have coffee and you're starting with scattered koa, our programs won't install a coffee plantation per se. We can plan that under TA for sure, or technical assistance. But we can, however, install a koa overstory component in an existing coffee plantation. So that is just where you want to keep in mind where our programs start and stop. And you can see a resource concern That's typical for this type of situation would be degraded plant condition. Usually we are seeing people planting shade trees over orchards as a method where 379 is being employed. And the three different purposes under that standard you could pretty much pick any one of those three and you'd be in good shape. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I noticed you got net carbon storage. Are we trying to, is that a goal we're trying to get?
Yep, that's one of our resource concerns, and it is one of the purposes under Conservation Practice Standard 379, so absolutely.
Wally, there was an article last week about how much each of us contribute to the melting of the sea ice. So I guess if we take that seriously, we can say that's how much we're preventing the melting of the Arctic ice.
So how are we measuring that?
We
Is that
don't
quantifiable?
We don't explicitly measure it, but if we are broadly, and I guess our spec would be if you're planting trees, we consider that you've addressed a carbon issue. If it's shrubs only, we kind of don't really go there, I guess. We prefer it to be the tree component that we're enhancing to claim the carbon pathway. Good question. Any other ones? All right, well, here's a different kind of starting point where you're basically clearing everything. This is a site in Windward, Oahu, 100% alien invasive forest cover, and this cooperator cleared the site with dozer and the slash was piled at the bottom of the field there, outside the field. And the last few large trees were a little too dangerous to remove with the dozer, so they came back and felled those by hand. This particular cooperator also planted a cover crop just as a temporary soil stabilization measure, and you can see the greening of that coming in on the soil surface. This would be an example where you're going to probably plan tree shrub establishment because we're essentially starting with a blank slate. And a typical resource concern here would be degraded plant condition, excessive plant pest pressure, and we would be improving our desirable plant diversity if we're following up with installation of an agroforest. Here's what that site might look like after it was planted out. In this case, it's a coffee orchard, so this is cropland, not forest land, but it's still an applicable use of 612. And there are scattered acacia koa trees throughout the coffee seedlings that will grow up to be shade for the coffee orchard. So this is back to that image I showed you previously. This is kind of really the meat and potatoes of today's presentation, the mixed agroforest idea. This is a forest in Pohnpei, Federated States of Micronesia, and you can see that there are some patches of taller, thicker forest and then some gaps where smaller, more light-loving plants are growing, like the banana, and there's kava here. What else? There's citrus, coconut, and annual crops are scattered throughout this particular mixed agroforest. So this is a classic view of a mixed agroforest or multi-story cropping system in a mature form or grown-out form. Kind of a similar example from American Samoa. This is a field of secondary forest that was colonized by pioneer species, and the landowner decided to clear that in favor of a more managed forest of more desired species. This was manual site prep with lopping and scattering. And then the same field planted out sometime later, and some really interesting things going on here. This cooperator chose to address the steep nature of this field by installing vetiver vegetative barriers, and that was to address, of course, water movement, soil erosion, sediment, and all that. Then between those rows of vetiver, native trees were planted randomly, and it was a wildlife project for fruit bat. So there's going to be forage and roost habitat for the fruit bat, but those same fruit trees are going to be producing things that are useful for the subsistence of the cooperator in the village.
Michael, this is
Yes.
Jessica American Samuel. I'm having, I can't see the slideshow.
Okay. Did you see it at all yet?
Yeah. Yeah, I was on the whole time. It just went off.
Is any other office having that same issue?
We can see it, Hilo.
Okay, unfortunately, I think that may be a network issue relating to your office. Can anybody else think of something?
I can't unless it has something to do with
That's
that.
fine.
Okay, great.
That error message that we keep getting maybe is,
You got it back, Jessica?
Back up.
Okay, great, great.
I think that error message is somehow affecting this.
So this was out in Batia, Jessica, and really, really fantastic project there on Tutuila. Another one that was just equally impressive to me that Renee folks are working on out of Maui, and this was a really, really competent cooperator. Some of the other agroforestry things they had going in their area, I would just love to take you all on a field trip to. But they had this field that was covered with big eucalyptus trees. It's very steep, probably at least 35% slope, if not more. And they wanted to put in a mixed agroforest here. So their site prep involved taking down some pretty big trees, and what I encouraged them to do is to lay those trees down on the contour. And what the logs are going to help is kind of help naturally terrace that slope. If there's any soil movement, it'll build up on the backside of those logs, and they're staked in nicely. You could go further and you could plant something like a gliricidia at close spacing, perhaps every 2 or 4 feet along those logs, and they'll help hold the log, and you could manage those as a low hedge to produce either green manure to lay down on the field surface as a nitrogen fixing source. It could be fodder for livestock. So a couple options relating to managing resource concerns relating to water quality and soil at the same time as managing invasive species issues. And one thing we talked about, and I'm not sure where we're at, I have to check with Renee on, but one option for the planting plan would be not to necessarily pick a certain number of species and quantities of each and then space them all out relatively evenly over the landscape, but to maybe plant out this field in patches, and in the upper zones on the high slopes, put in those larger trees that require less visitation and management. They're harder to get to. And then maybe in the lower slope, you might consider putting smaller trees, your shrubs, and even your annual crops at the ground layer. And that would facilitate easier access from the bottom area, which is where the road and the headquarters is, for more regular management. So another really fantastic project example there in Maui. Well, that Maui project, the intention is to plant really great diversity under the mixed agroforest. I'm just going to kind of rewind a little bit and go back to a multi-story cropping, simple, more two-dimensional example. This is just a timber species over an orchard species, cacao, mahogany over cacao. And I'll get to it again later in the presentation, but I just want you to look at this picture and imagine the mahogany as 10-inch diameter trees that are 40 feet tall and closed canopy. And that's going to be pretty tough on cacao. Cacao do like moderate shade, but they don't like pure shade. And so I think in this case, the initial planting density may have been a little too high, and something's going to have to give later on as the trees start getting bigger. similar concept, this one on Oahu. Here we had existing koa, acacia koa, that were underplanted with cacao to create a multi-story forest. As we talked about with habitat restoration projects, native forest and wildlife, there are still the same 4 basic categories of plants. The first one, noxious and invasive species, these are the ones we're generally trying to reduce, if not eradicate if possible. We have non-invasive, non-native species. These become very important for mixed agroforests because they tend to include some of the species that our cooperators are really interested in. We have the native species that are from nearby islands or ecoregions, but not actually native to your specific site. Those are okay to plant. I've had examples where somebody was on the Big Island and they said they wanted to plant a hibiscus species that's native to Oahu. Well, if you're not next to a native forest area that has Big Island native hibiscus, if you're down in a disturbed lower elevation site, if you're not doing wildlife habitat, that's okay. And in those instances, we just plan and contract those particular plants as non-native because they are not native to your exact site. Then, of course, last, we do have the native species, the native or endemic species from your exact location, and those are always okay to use. So how do you start? Where do you go? Again, we would encourage you to use the veg spec to generate an initial plant list using your island or island location, elevation, and annual rainfall as your primary initial criteria. We'll look at both native and non-native species typically. And you can follow the TechNode 11, Forestry TechNode 11. There's links to good resources on our forestry page under the agroforestry.info site that I mentioned earlier with the Grower's Guide, and a lot of other really fantastic publications, many of which include profiles on individual agroforestry species. So they're really wonderful 2- or 3-page tech notes, essentially. But a lot of them are collated into larger volumes, and they're fantastic. The World Agroforestry Center out of Kenya has some great species information as well, other literature that you may find. And then keep in mind always your weed and insect and disease pressures that are factors on your site. Insects, diseases, if you know that there are serious ones in the vicinity, we might want to kind of shy away from species that are susceptible to those particular pathogens. And as with our native ecosystem restoration projects, it's quite common for our agroforestry people to still be interested in threatened and endangered native plants. And bottom line is that's okay, but try to discourage people who are not very fluent in the process or experienced in dealing with these species, because it can tend to bog down your planning. The regulatory framework is fairly strict. The permitting requirements are strong. If they want to do that, that's fantastic, and we'll work with them, but just warn them that it's fairly intensive. So once you have your initial list, go ahead and talk to the cooperator and find out which of those, if any, they feel are of high priority. Take a look at what might actually be available from your nurseries, including consideration of time frames and lead time. Have a conversation with the cooperator about the cost. This is important because we pay a price to install per seedling or per cutting based on a conservation pricing framework, which means relatively low. So if you want to plant mango in a mixed agroforest or lychee, that's great, but they need to be aware that they might go to the nursery and find out that that seedling costs $30 and our payment rate is only going to be 8 or 10. So that's just a really important reality for this that ought to be mentioned.
And Michael, if I can just clarify, so the time frame there refers to, for example, if a nursery says, yeah, they can grow something, but they don't have it on stock right away, how long would it take kind of thing?
That's one important aspect. The other is your typical planting season.
Okay.
So if we usually do recommend you plant during a rainy season, unless you're in a location that gets really good rain throughout all of the calendar months, or most of them. So if you're aiming to plant during a rainy season, you need to figure out, okay, how many months away is that, and how many months do my nurseries need to grow out before we're ready to plug those seeds.
So that their supply is there when you're ready to plant.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Excellent question. Thanks. We talked about target density last week for native forest restoration, and the numbers were a lot higher. And that is because native plants, when you're planting pure native plants, they tend to be not as competitive as some of our weed species. So we encourage really high densities in our native forest restoration plantings. With our agroforests, we're going to be planting species that are probably, on average, a little bit more competitive with weeds, and we'll be able to handle that weed pressure a little better. And we want to plant for a density where we're not expecting mortality due to competition, which we expect later in the native forest restoration cycle. If you plant 1,200 native plants per acre, we kind of expect that 20 or 30% of those might die off after 5 or 10 years once the canopy closes. Whereas here in our agroforests, we're kind of zeroing in more on our final density from the word go. And so our tree spacing can vary really dramatically. If you have a specimen production type tree that's going into your agroforest, like a mango, you might want to plant that 40 feet apart from the next mango, or maybe even more, because it's a big tree and it throws a big canopy up and it has a lot of shade. Our shrubs tend to be in the 7.5 to 10 foot range. These are not hardwired, but just some typical ranges for your consideration. Any questions? All right. Well, some of those considerations you can find in a document that Kealakekua Field Office came up with, and I assisted a little bit with that. I really appreciated their initiative on this. But it's called the PIA, Planning for Forestry Plantings and Seedling Acquisition. It's kind of like a Cliff's Notes type of document, and it talks about some of those things like lead time and costs and species selection. So some of those things are on this document, which is, I think, the very first link on our forestry webpage. So you can find it there. The PIA Plant Materials Tech Note gives a list of various nurseries throughout PIA. We are potentially going to compile periodic data about what is actually available in a given year at nurseries. That has yet to be brought to a wide application, but we did it for 1 year out of Kona. We do have and hope to have more resources on our web pages. And as we mentioned last week, we encourage you folks to enhance your own knowledge. We'll come help with one-on-one training or with a particular field office if you want. We'll come out and do that. If you see a mini course, jump on it, and hopefully we'll get support for you, including tuition if there is any. And always work with our staff who are really knowledgeable about plants. We have some really good folks throughout PIA who are very knowledgeable, and don't hesitate to lean on them. It's not just Jennifer and myself. These are some points I and our colleagues mentioned during the rollout of that Grower's Guide document that I showed at the beginning. About a year ago, we did a series of webinars or seminars throughout the state of Hawaii. And we got some really good feedback on these points, so I wanted to kind of revisit those here. I thought they might help. So I appreciate our cooperators who are passionate and really want to get out there and get their hands dirty and do it all themselves. So do it yourself is great, but advise people that there's a point where there's diminishing returns, and try not to bite off too much that they can handle by themselves. Sometimes it is more efficient to hire a contractor or a company that specializes in a particular type of work, especially site preparation. Similarly, I have a lot of appreciation for our organic cooperators, and I personally don't like to use herbicides when I don't have to. However, if you are in a site that has really high weed pressure and you're going to be facing pretty tough competition from the weeds, even after you treat them 1 or 2, possibly even 3 times, herbicides can really be the make or break technical aspect of a conservation plan. And so it at least needs to be part of the conversation. And if it's for those who are hesitant to use them, just say, how about would you consider just using them as the initial knockdown only and then staying away from them after that? And as I alluded to earlier in that one slide with the with the mahogany over cacao seedlings, take care with your spacing. Try and envision in your mind and in your conversations with your cooperator what those plants look like at their mature size.
Big critters, I like that.
A few extra points. Some of our services can't really be engaged unless there's that resource concern and problem there. So if you come into a place where you have a non-invasive species and they want an agroforest, we might not be able to help them with site prep, for example. They may need to do that on their own. Or, as I mentioned previously, we might be able to install shade for a plantation, but not the actual plantation. And then I have been asked periodically about, hey, how can we do wildlife projects with these mixed agroforests? And it's a little tough. There are a few. Our native species, native wildlife species tend to want native forest more, and that's kind of the emphasis we've had in the past. But with a mixed agroforest, you possibly could address some wildlife concerns, particularly relating to pollinators or tree roosting species that aren't necessarily shy of people or cryptic in their biological needs and their habitat needs.
So that was the example of the American Samoa fruit bat planting, would be an example of that?
Yeah, they're not particularly shy of people. They can be active right around your house even.
Okay.
So yeah.
And of course, being a fruit bat, they prefer the fruit trees.
That's correct.
Okay.
So that's a good example. Well, let's start diving into more and more detail here. So our Forestry Agroforestry Tech Note 7 is our mixed agroforestry spec. And what we're laying down in the introductory language of that document is that agroforests are forests. So they go on forest land in the NRCS land use system. They're collections of plants with very high diversity in terms of the number of species, the canopy structure and arrangement, but they're still forests. They're still providing, mimicking those really key services that native forests provide. Perhaps maybe not quite as good as a native forest, but pretty close. And what's kind of good about mixed agroforests is they provide an interesting dimension to a producer in terms of providing not only environmental but economic stability. There's high diversity, so you might not be susceptible to an individual pathogen. If there's an extreme weather event, maybe some parts of your forest will take damage while others won't. So it's kind of a resilient system.
And the economic aspect is you've got a product from that forest that you can either consume or sell.
Yeah, or it helps your subsistence in what's on your table,
right.
and it provides, again, if one part of the system goes down for a reason, you still have other parts of it to rely on.
Okay, thank you.
So I just put these on here so it would be a reference for your future, but these are some of your typical NRCS resource concerns. But kind of going back, circling back, we're not calling these are not commercial production systems. We're not trying to put people into a commercial operation or endeavor. So these are just systems that are requiring lower inputs than cropland or commercial orchards even, and we're targeting subsistence needs at a small scale. So some of the more nitty-gritty parts of the tech note, we're requiring that at least 20% of your stem count will be native, and no more than 50% will be production-type species. So those would be your non-timber forest products typically, and there's a table in the tech note, which I'll show later in this presentation, that shows a few things, including the maximum quantities for each particular species or genus of plant. And that third category is non-native species that are not production. They can be up to 80% of your system because you have at least 20% native. But it's more typically in the 0 to 30% range because one of the driving desirable aspects of these agroforests is to have those production non-timber forest product species.
So what would be an example of a non-native of that 0 to 8%? Something that's like a eucalyptus or a mahogany? Or
it might be a eucalyptus tree or a timber type species, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be a really good example. Gliricidia is another one. It's not really a production species per se, but it's a nitrogen-fixing tree that's multi-purpose and multi-use. Has other benefits. So that's another really good one.
Okay.
Any other questions at this point?
And we apologize for for some of you, this presentation is going in and out. We're not sure why. We are getting this kind of error message. I have to keep clicking it off every time it comes on. So if the presentation goes out, just bear with us. It'll come back up again, hopefully shortly. So apologize for that. We've got Brenda looking into this.
So here's that table too I just mentioned. And let's see here. So a couple things. So you have a lot of the species that are fairly common and of interest to our cooperators. We break up our planting recommendations based on inclusion of a certain number of tall and short genera, so that's detailed in this column. Some spacing guidelines are provided here in the fourth column. And then that fifth column gives a maximum ceiling for the number of plants in that species or in that genus that can go in to a particular farm. And that includes, you have to count what's existing on the farm elsewhere. So even if it's not in your agroforestry field and you already have 10 cashew trees, the first one, you could only plant 2 more to get up to this level of 12 because we don't want to expand people's plantings on their farm into a level that gets beyond what would be considered subsistence.
In other words, it starts approaching an orchard type thing.
Seems to be starting to approach commercial.
Right.
Yep. And then just ending off this part of the presentation with a couple examples. These are lists that some of our field offices put together to help them frame up the tech note. And I thought these were really nice examples. And it helps, because we're trying to cover a few different criteria in the development of our planting lists, having a table like this is really helpful. So, for example, this was a 3-acre site, and we needed 6 tall and 6 short genera. So this list includes at least 6 of each in this column. So that's great. We got that covered. Then there was a total of 912 seedlings planned for a 3-acre field, and half went into the non-timber forest product category and half went into native. So we were at the maximum level, up to 50% for the non-timber forest product trees, and we exceeded the minimum of 20% for the native, so we covered that. And that was a fairly nice plan that was put together. Any questions on this table?
The wide and the narrow, what is that? That's the canopy?
That was kind of more of a spacing and canopy consideration and I think a planting spacing consideration that this particular project came up with. So that was over in these 2 columns right here. Got it. This one, don't panic. It's a more complicated example, but it's basically doing the exact same thing. And over here on the far right, we're finding out which of these species would rank out as tall or short. And we have great diversity there, so we're covered. 175 total plants, 67 of which are non-timber forest product, and that's less than 50%, so we're fine there. 88 individuals were in the native column, which is close to half. So we're over the minimum 20% criteria there. And then these folks did pick that 3rd category, non-production, non-native. And those were represented by Gliricidia and Spanish cedar. And what else did we have? Oh, down here, Honduran mahogany. So any questions there? I'm going to transition out of this part of the presentation into an example with our IR template. Okay, give me 1 second. Blow this up.
Yeah.
So could somebody confirm that you're able to see a planting diagram? Alex, can you see that?
You guys might be on mute. We're not hearing anything.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. It's coming up.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Wally. Okay, this is actually at the tail end of the veg spec. So this is after you've gone through the plant selection module and you've gone on to the implementation requirement template or job sheet. And I just wanted to point out that on the lower left here, there are these tabs that show some example diagrams. And I encourage you to use those or take a look at them just to give yourself ideas. But this is a system where we were designing a cacao orchard that needed just light shade throughout the orchard. And cacao is typically planted on a 7.5-foot on center spacing in its most dense and intensive cultivation. So what the design here shows is that type of spacing kind of in an alley. So these are 7.5 feet apart, cacao. But then a tree row So we have tree rows here and here. And we put a little extra space, so the distance between those tree rows and the double row of cacao is 10 feet instead of 7.5, just to give them a little bit more light. And then between the trees, so that would give 27 feet between each row of trees. I guess 27.5 feet. And then I went with 20 feet between each tree here so that you wouldn't have too much shade. And then because there seemed to be a little bit of extra room, I suggested dropping in an extra cacao in between every pair of trees within the tree rows, just because typically our producers want to maximize their production. So that was just a theoretical example. And so what I did is I looked at that pattern, and here's the repeating pattern, or the block of timber tree spacing, which is 20 by 27.5 feet. Well, in this particular block, you can see that there's 7 cacao. And then, but if you go over here and you do the same thing with the next tree, oops, I went too far. There's only 5 cacao instead of 7. And then I went to the third one, and I noticed I'm back to 7. And when I looked at it closely, what I discovered is for every 3 trees, the pattern repeats. You have 2 trees associated with 7 cacao and 1 with 5, and that repeats. So that helped me determine that the overall repeating pattern is for every 3 trees planted, you need to plant 19 cacao for this particular layout. I know that was a little bit detailed, but anybody confused or have a question on that?
What was the importance of knowing that? Why did you need to go through that exercise?
What that helps you do is come up with a planting quantity for your job sheet or your template in the end.
Sure, okay.
So
now you can just replicate that over the area that you have.
Right.
Okay.
So what we were assuming here, I think this was a 1 acre field assumed, so I'm going to scroll down here now. And if you fill in this diagram, you can see that with 20 by 27 foot spacing here on the right, you're going to need about 79 trees to fill out that acre. And then because with every, going back up just a little bit, so for every 3 shade trees, you have 19 cacao, or 6.3 cacao per shade tree. You just simply multiply 79 times 6.33, and you come up with 500 cacao. And I simply entered those down here under the other spacing group category in the job sheet template, because they're planted in a kind of asymmetrical pattern, a double row with some in between on the tree rows. So you would just need to describe that in the narrative part of your implementation requirement template. And then in the planting area of that template that you would hand the cooperator, you have 79 trees, and let's say you split them 40 cacao, Gliricidia and 39 coconut, and then your 500 cacao, and that's basically your planting plan. And that's how the job sheet would look. You would probably include some narratives, as I mentioned, to talk about how to lay out your cacao, and you should be good to go. Any confusion, questions, comments on that particular example?
So that's seems a relatively simple diagram relative to the mixed agroforestry. When you start getting a really complex one, like you talked about earlier, how do you design it using this sort of a methodology?
Tony, you couldn't have asked a better question. That's my next example.
I wasn't set up to ask that. I didn't have any clue. Okay, you're there.
All right. So again, over here we have the template to fill out, and that's what you always see when you first navigate in. But right next to it, we have this tab, and it's a job sketch. And after working with folks for a long time, I get the impression that probably, a pretty good percentage of people are not taking advantage of this. And I think it's really important. I'd like to encourage you all to use this sketch, either the one here or just on a piece of paper. But sketching out your planting plan is so important to coming up with something that makes sense and works. So I can't emphasize enough, I think some form of a sketch is critically important.
Wouldn't it be important, too, not only so the client can implement this practice correctly, but also whoever's going to go out and certify it, they've got something to compare it to? That'd be fair to say.
I think so, definitely. So let's start a bit over here, though, to help frame up that particular sketch. So what I was thinking is, how about a bare site? We're going to use tree shrub establishment to plant that out into a mixed agroforest. And we're thinking of using some trees that are spaced very widely apart, some medium to smaller sized trees a little bit closer, and then some small trees or shrubs interspersed in between here and there. You can use this right side of the planner side, as I tend to call it for this template. You can use this tool to help you come up with a rough approximation of the spacings and quantities of plants for each spacing group, if you're comfortable and you want to, but it's optional. If it's easier for you to make a hand sketch on a piece of paper and come down to this row that says Other and simply put in the quantity of plants that you know you need, you're welcome to do that. I just find that for coming up with a basic planting plan for these complex agroforests, that this tool can actually be helpful. So one of the key assumptions of the tool is you have to pick your least common denominator in terms of spacing, the closest spacing plants, and you have to go upwards of that in doubles. So in other words, 7.5, 15, 30, 60, 120, you're doubling every time. As long as you follow that, this tool will help you come up with a really good basic approximation. So here I chose 7.5 as the closest spacing that any plants in this system would be planted at.
Your C group plants, for example.
And that typically ends up as your C. Sure. So Tony, I did go ahead and do that. But then when you start in, you flip it and you start at your highest spacing for group A. And so we'll say, well, we'll plant our biggest trees 30 feet apart, 30 feet within row, 30 feet between rows. Then the smaller trees, we're going to plant 15 feet apart, and the shrubs and very small trees, maybe 7.5 feet apart. So on a grid for this field, which I punched in as 3/4 of an acre, you could fit up to 581 plants. That's what this is telling you right here. And if you're at 30 by 30 foot spacing, you can fit in 3/4 of an acre a maximum of 36. So what I did is I came down here and I selected 3 species that I thought would be beneficial to place at very wide spacing. The first 2, because they tend to be bigger trees with dense crowns. And the third species, the coconut, because I think that's a nice species to plant. It grows tall, but it has a crown that doesn't throw dense shade on one spot on the ground for the whole day. So it's kind of like you're throwing something up that allows you something great to have space to plant under. So that was going to be my species group A at the widest spacing, and I picked a total of 36 seedlings to recommend that the cooperator plant. So I would enter 36 over here. And as soon as I do that, that's saying, yeah, you used up all the planting points for trees at 30-foot spacing, and it happened to reduce this number as to what's left for what I could plant at 15 feet to what, for those spots that land in between the trees planted at 30-foot spacing. So again, excuse me, I picked 3 trees that tend to be on the smaller side, more compact. And this was for a theoretical site in Guam. And so we picked a couple native species. Morinda is native in Guam, Lada, as it's known there, and Noni in Hawaii. Maybe, I think in Samoa it's Nonu, but I'm not sure. And I picked 110 of those. I guess I should have picked 109 if I was going to stick by my math over on this side. So I'm going to pick 109 of those guys. And again, watch this number for the spacing group. See, it's going to go down as soon as I enter that. And now I have room to put in up to 435 plants at that tighter spacing. Okay. Any questions so far? That's kind of the more complicated part of this, planning this practice. Okay. Well, we can come back to questions. But for now, I'll switch back to the diagram. So here's what I did. I assumed each box on this grid was 2.5 feet. So that means every 3 cells, I could plant one of those shrub-type plants. And I just laid out a grid. So there you have it. What I did, though, is I put those trees at 30-foot spacing in first. So I put these 30 feet apart in this row. And then I decided to stagger the trees here by offsetting them relative to the first row of trees. But again, these are 30 feet apart. And then the same thing in this third row. But then I did an additional consideration. I thought to myself, well, I'm going to split species group A, the wide spacing guys, into 2 subgroups, because that coconut really is a little bit more sun-friendly with plants growing around it, and the mango is a sun hog. So what I decided to do is where the mango and the mangosteen were going to go is I emptied these cells that are shown in a bold square, and I thought, let's not plant a plant there. Let's just leave that open and give that mango tree a little bit more elbow room and not set trees up so close to it that they're almost going to fail for sure within the first 5 years. You could argue about doing the same thing with all these, but I just said for this sake we'll take out the 4 that are closest and we'll leave the 4 here that are on the diagonal corners. You could go either way. There's no perfectly right or wrong answer, but I just kind of want to show you a nuance and extra consideration you might make. Then the blue cells represent those 3 species that will be on 15-foot spacing, species group B, and the gray will be species group C, all the stuff at close proximity to each other. So coming back over here, I left a few, so even though we could plant up to 435 at the closest spacing, I scaled back, assuming that some of those mango and mangosteen would have less seed shrubs located next to them. And I picked a slightly lower number, and this was, I think, 355 total. There it is. So I enter that in there. And we're at about 500 plants in a system that could have potentially up to 580, but we're leaving out about 80 so that those mangoes and mangosteen have some elbow room. Let's go back and do a quick review. For our native plants, we have 90 trees. We have 180 shrubs that are native. So we're looking pretty good. We're at 270 native plants, which is well over 20% of the 500. And then let's go to kind of the production species. Coffee and black pepper, yes, those are production. You might consider Morinda or Lada as production, but it's native in Guam, so it does not go into that count in my assessment. But you do have these other ones plus the citrus. So we have, let's see, we have about 195, 230 production plants, which is less than 50% of your 500 total. So check, we're good there. And that's kind of it for my presentation on that more complex, real nitty-gritty example of a mixed agroforest. We have 6 tall stature and 5 short stature species. That fits our criteria for a 0.75 acre field according to the tech note, so we're good there. Any thoughts, questions, comments?
Could you go back to the job sketch a second? So that job sketch doesn't represent the whole field. That's just an example of what you would apply to the field. Is that right?
That's correct, because
so this isn't scaled to represent the entire field.
It's just a portion. Yeah, just to give an idea of what your repeating pattern might look like.
Right, okay.
And you know, when you actually get out there and start planting, it doesn't have to be these perfect rows by any means.
Sure.
The whole reason we have this tool over here is to get us in the right ballpark for the quantity of seedlings, to help us get our spacing ideas mapped out mentally and physically on a sketch. But once you actually get to the field and start planting, you might plant things in more clumps, maybe a few trees next to each other and a few shrubs and pure plantings, and that's perfectly okay. There's some extra guidelines on how to do that right within the Tech Note 11, and I would encourage people to just read that and make sure they follow the guidelines on that.
But what I think I grasped from your job sketch, though, Michael, is the spacing needed around those bigger trees. In other words, you got to have vision to project how much space they're going to need in the long run, and that sketch helped my simple brain at least see that.
Sure.
I like that. I mean, the orange dots, for example, I can picture my own mangoes, and they need that kind of space. And if I didn't have this, I might be inclined to think, oh, I can plant these things closer. But when you see
they arguably need more space than this. But in an agroforest, maybe the cooperator would keep the trees pruned smaller, or maybe they would give up a few more of these close planted species. Whereas for this coconut tree over here,
you don't need it.
A shrub should do just fine 7.5 feet away from a coconut stalk.
Well, no, this helps a lot. I like that.
So, yeah.
Thinking about my own place.
Okay, any other thoughts or questions, comments on this presentation, any part of it? Okay, you guys are an easy crowd, but thank you very much. And if you have questions for me, please refer back to this recording, but of course call me anytime, and I'd be glad to work with you on any of these projects.
And you're more than willing to run out in the field and help them get one of these in?
I would like to